The latch clicked home with a sound like a gunshot in the frozen November air. Hannah Thorne stood 3 feet from the heavy oak door of her uncle's cabin, watching the iron bolt slide into place on the other side. The wood was still warm where her palm had rested against it seconds before begging, without words for reconsideration. Now the warmth was gone. The door had become a wall. Beside her, Clara shifted the flour sack higher on her shoulder. Inside it, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth, a small ceramic jar held the sourdough starter their mother had kept alive for 15 years before the typhoid took her. Clara had fed it that morning with the last pinch of flour from the kitchen tin, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of ritual. The starter was still warm against her ribs, insulated by wool and desperation. Hannah's sack held different cargo. 2 books, their spines cracked from repeated reading, a geological survey of the Colorado Rockies published by the Colorado School of Mines, and an almanac dense with tables of frost dates and lunar phases. Beneath them, folded into a perfect square, lay a hand-drawn map she had spent 3 months creating from memory and observation. At its center, a single word in her careful script: breath. The wind came down from the peaks with a sound like tearing canvas. It carried no moisture yet, only the hard promise of what was building in the north. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, low and heavy, pressing down on the valley of Black Ridge Hollow like a lid on a cooking pot. In another hour, maybe 2, the first snow would fall. By nightfall, the world would be erased. Hannah turned to look at her sister. Clara's face was identical to her own in every measurable way. The same gray eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same mouth that rarely curved into a smile. But where Hannah's gaze always seemed to be measuring distances and calculating angles, Clara's eyes held a different quality. She looked at the world the way a gardener looks at soil, assessing what could grow there, what might be coaxed into life with the right care. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been communicated in the 1,000 silent exchanges that had marked their 20 years together. They had known this was coming. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. Behind that closed door, their uncle Ezra Thorne sat at his kitchen table with his head in his hands. He had not looked at them when he handed over the 2 flour sacks, had not met their eyes when he pointed toward the mountain pass. His voice had been steady when he spoke, but his hands had trembled as he placed a small bundle of dried venison and a hill of black bread into each sack. The trembling had not been from cold. It had been from the weight of a choice he could not take back. The people of Black Ridge Hollow had given him that choice in 100 small ways over the past 6 months. The way Reverend Obadiah Crane's sermons had begun to linger on the unnaturalness of certain silences. The way the women at the general store had stopped including Ezra in their conversations about the weather and the coming winter. The way his credit at Henderson's had slowly tightened, never refused outright, but always requiring a few more days, a bit more scrutiny. A man could withstand a lot of pressure if he was made of the right material. Ezra Thorne was not made of that material. He was made of softer stuff: the need to belong, the hunger for the comfort of familiar faces, the deep human terror of standing alone. When the choice came down to his community or his blood, the community had won. It always did. Hannah adjusted her grip on the flour sack and started walking. Not toward the mountain pass as Ezra had directed, but down the slope toward the tree line. Clara fell into step beside her without question. Their boots crunched through the frozen grass in perfect synchronization, a rhythm they had established in childhood and never broken. The story of how they had become what they were began 10 years earlier in the summer of 1863, when the typhoid came to Black Ridge Hollow, riding in on a shipment of contaminated grain. Their father, William Thorne, had been a mining engineer from Pennsylvania, drawn west by the promise of silver in the Colorado mountains. He had brought with him a small library, technical manuals on ore extraction, geological surveys, agricultural bulletins from the United States Department of Agriculture. Books were expensive, knowledge was currency. He had invested in both. Their mother, Elizabeth, had been the daughter of a groundskeeper at a wealthy estate in Connecticut. She had learned to read the soil the way other women read sheet music, could tell you what would thrive in shade and what needed sun, which plants were companions, and which would choke each other out. She had kept a sketchbook filled with drawings of wildflowers, cloud formations, the changing shapes of leaves through the seasons. On the last two pages, she had drawn her infant daughters side by side, impossible to tell apart. The typhoid took both parents within a week of each other. Hannah remembered her father's last coherent words, spoken in the delirium of fever. Limestone breathes Hannah. Where the stone breathes, there's life. She had been 10 years old and had not understood. She understood now. Ezra had taken them in because there was no one else. Family was family, and in 1863, that still meant something even to a man who would rather have been left alone. He had fed them and clothed them and expected nothing in return except work. They had given him that and more. They had given him an efficiency that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. The people of Blackridge Hollow could not articulate exactly what disturbed them about the Thorne sisters. It was not that they were identical, twins were rare but not unheard of. It was not that they were quiet, plenty of girls were raised to hold their tongues. It was the quality of their silence, the way they seemed to communicate without speaking, the uncanny coordination of their movements. Clara would begin to hoe a row of beans, and Hannah would appear with the water bucket at the exact moment the work was done, as if she had been watching from inside Clara's mind. Hannah would reach for a shovel, and Clara's hand would already be extending it, the exchange happening in the space between heartbeats. No words, no hesitation, just a seamless flow of shared intention that looked like witchcraft to people who had never experienced it. They had no friends among the other children of the valley. They did not gossip or sing or attend the church socials where young people were supposed to learn the rituals of courtship and community. They worked, and when the work was done, they read. Not the novels and poetry that the preacher's wife sometimes offered, but the technical material their father had left behind. Agricultural bulletins on crop rotation and soil amendment. Geological surveys explaining the formation of limestone caves and the behavior of underground water systems. Almanacs dense with data about frost patterns and growing seasons. They did not read for entertainment. They read to understand the world as a system of knowable rules, a machine that could be predicted and manipulated if you had the right information. Where others saw divine mystery or random chance, they saw patterns. Where others saw miracles, they saw cause and effect. This difference had marked them as strange from the beginning, but it had been their success with the cold frame that had transformed strangeness into something darker. They had built it in late September using salvaged lumber and scraps of oiled canvas, applying principles Hannah had found in a bulletin from Luther Burbank, the California plant breeder whose work was beginning to revolutionize American agriculture. The construction had been simple, a slanted glass cover over a raised bed positioned against the south-facing wall of the smokehouse to capture maximum sunlight. By mid-November, when every other garden in Blackridge Hollow had been killed by the first hard frost, their cold frame still produced crisp lettuce and sharp radishes. The harvest was small, barely enough to supplement their own meals, but it was green and alive in a world that had turned brown and dead. It should have been admired. Instead, it became evidence. Reverend Crane had stood in Ezra's kitchen 3 days ago, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying the weight of moral certainty. A quiet woman is a blessing, Ezra. But two quiet women who think the same thought at the same time, who make things grow, when God himself has declared the season over, that is a silence that argues with the Almighty. The words had given holy sanction to the town's unease. The sisters were not just odd, they were blasphemous. Their knowledge came from somewhere it should not. Their success was unnatural. And unnatural things had no place in a God-fearing community. Ezra had tried to defend them in his way. He had pointed out their usefulness, their obedience, their lack of any actual harm. But defense required conviction, and conviction required a kind of strength he did not possess. When Crane had leaned in close and said, "Winter is coming, Ezra. A man must choose who he shelters when the cold sets in," the choice had already been made. Hannah and Clara reached the edge of the tree line and paused. Behind them, the cabin sat silent and closed smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray thread. Ahead, the forest opened like a mouth. The wind was picking up, carrying the first bite of real cold. They had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left, maybe less, once the snow started in earnest. Hannah knelt and opened her flour sack, pulling out the hand-drawn map. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers already stiffening in the cold. The map showed the valley and the ridgeline to the west marked with notations in her precise handwriting. Elevation changes, limestone outcroppings, a narrow ravine that cut down from the high country sheltered from the prevailing winds. And at the base of a cliff face, a small X with that single word, breath. She had seen it only once 3 weeks ago on one of the long walks she and Clara took when the work was done and Ezra was occupied elsewhere. They were not supposed to wander far from the homestead, but enforcement of that rule had grown lax over the years. They were too efficient, too self-contained. Ezra had learned that watching them was unnecessary. They always came back. That particular afternoon, Hannah had been testing a theory drawn from her father's geological survey. The book described how limestone formations in the Colorado Rockies often contained extensive cave systems formed over millennia by the slow dissolution of calcium carbonate in groundwater. Some of these caves, the survey noted, exhibited geothermal warming due to their depth and proximity to volcanic substrata. The effect was subtle but measurable, a constant temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions. She had been looking for evidence of such a system for months, studying the landscape for the telltale signs unusual plant growth in winter. Areas where snow melted faster, the presence of certain mosses that thrived in humid temperate conditions. She had found all three in the ravine, west of the valley, clustered around a dark opening at the base of a limestone cliff. She had not entered the cave that day. There had been no time, and she had been alone. But she had stood at the entrance and felt it, a faint current of air moving outward from the darkness, warmer than the October afternoon around her. The stone was breathing. Her father's fevered words had been literal truth, not delirium. Clara looked at the map, then at the darkening sky. Her voice when she spoke was barely louder than the wind. "We have maybe 2 hours before we lose the light." Hannah nodded. The pass Ezra had indicated would be choked with snow by morning, a slow death by exposure for anyone caught in the open. But the ravine, if they could reach it, might offer something else. Not safety exactly, not comfort, but a chance. And a chance was more than most people got when the door closed and the latch clicked. Home. They started walking again, leaving the cabin and the valley behind. The trees closed around them, bare branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The wind followed, growing stronger, with each step carrying the first dry flakes of snow. The flakes were small and hard, more ice than snow, stinging where they hit exposed skin. Hannah led, navigating by memory in the failing light. She had walked this route 3 times in the past weeks, memorizing landmarks: the lightning-struck pine with the split trunk, the cluster of 3 boulders arranged like a giant's cairn, the creek bed that ran dry in autumn, but would guide them west if they followed it upstream. Clara walked behind her steps, matching her sister's, exactly, trusting without question. The trust between them was absolute, because it had never been tested. They had never disagreed, never wanted different things, never felt the pull of separate paths. Where other siblings grew apart as they aged, developing distinct personalities and conflicting desires, Hannah and Clara had moved in the opposite direction. Each year had brought them closer until the boundary between them had become so thin as to be nearly invisible. They were not 2 people who thought alike. They were 1 mind in 2 bodies, and that was what frightened everyone. The snow began in earnest as the light faded. It came horizontally, driven by wind that had turned vicious, a physical force that pushed against them as they climbed. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that moved through wool and cotton like they were not there, finding skin and pulling heat away with ruthless efficiency. Hannah felt her face go numb first, the skin of her cheeks and nose losing sensation until her face felt like a mask. Then her hands. She had wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, but the cloth was thin and the cold was merciless. Her fingers progressed through stages burning ache, then pins and needles, then a terrifying numbness that made her grip on the flour sack uncertain. Behind her, Clara stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Neither of them spoke. Speaking required breath, and breath was a commodity they could not afford to waste. The exertion of the climb was keeping them warm barely, but it was also draining them. Each step upward through the deepening snow was a negotiation with exhaustion, a bargain struck with muscles that were beginning to shake and cramp. They found minimal shelter beneath a rock overhang, a shallow recess that blocked the direct assault of the wind but offered nothing like warmth. They huddled together, sharing body heat, their backs against stone that felt like ice. Clara's breathing was ragged, harsh in the near darkness. Hannah could feel her sister shivering, violent tremors that shook them both. The shivering was good. It meant their bodies were still fighting, still generating heat in a desperate bid to stay alive. But it was also costly. The relentless muscle contractions were burning through their remaining energy, using up fuel they did not have to spare. Soon the shivering would stop, and when it stopped, it would not be because they had gotten warm. Clara's voice came out as a cracked whisper, almost lost in the howl of wind. "We could go back." The words hung in the frozen air between them. Hannah stared out at the swirling chaos of white, but she was seeing something else. She saw the interior of Ezra's cabin, the thin meals of watered-down oatmeal, the way his eyes would slide past them at the dinner table, unable or unwilling to land. She saw the faces of the townswomen in Henderson's general store, the way conversation would freeze when she and Clara entered, smiles turning rigid and false. She felt the accumulated weight of a decade of small cruelties, 1,000 moments of being looked through, instead of being tolerated, but never wanted. Apologize for what? Her voice was rough with cold, but the words were clear. They cut through the storm like a blade. Clara did not answer. There was no need. The question contained its own answer, complete and final. There was nothing to go back to. There was no apology that would make them acceptable, no penance that would erase what they were. The door had closed. The latch had clicked. That chapter was over. Hannah forced herself to her feet, every muscle screaming in protest. She pulled Clara up beside her. The map was still in her coat pocket, but she did not need to look at it. She had memorized every line, every notation. The ravine was west and down, following the dry creek bed. They were close. They had to be close. The walking resumed slower now, each step a deliberate act of will. The snow was knee-deep in places, forcing them to lift their legs high, burning the last reserves of strength in their thighs and calves. Hannah's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, her peripheral awareness fading. She focused on the immediate one foot, then the other, then the first foot again. A rhythm, a meditation, a prayer to physics instead of God. The creek bed appeared suddenly a depression in the snow-covered ground. They turned to follow it, the walking easier now on the slight downhill grade. The wind was blocked here by the rising walls of the ravine, the air suddenly still. The snow fell straight down, thick flakes that obscured vision beyond a few yards. And then she saw it, a shadow against the pale stone of the cliff face darker than the surrounding rock. An opening low and narrow, partially hidden by the sweeping branches of an ancient juniper. Hannah had marked it on her map as approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough to enter, but small enough to have escaped notice by anyone not specifically looking for it. She stumbled forward, Clara close behind. At the mouth of the cave, she stopped and placed her hand against the stone. Even through her numb fingers, she could feel it, the faint movement of air flowing outward from the darkness. Not warm exactly, but not the killing cold of the storm. Still air, protected air, air that carried a different smell, not the sterile scent of ice and snow, but something rich and damp, the smell of earth and stone and enclosed space. Clara pressed close beside her, and together they stepped across the threshold. The change was immediate and profound. The wind stopped. The horizontal assault of snow ceased. The world became silent except for their ragged breathing and the distant moan of the storm outside. They stood in absolute darkness for a long moment, and waiting for their eyes to adjust. Gradually, shapes began to emerge. The cave was not a small hollow, but a passage sloping gently downward into the mountain. The walls were smooth limestone sculpted by ancient water into flowing curves. The ceiling was high enough to stand upright, the floor relatively level. Hannah fumbled in her coat pocket and pulled out the small tin of waterproof matches she had taken from Ezra's kitchen. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to strike one. The match flared a tiny sun in the darkness, and they saw what lay ahead. The passage continued for at least 50 yards before curving out of sight. The walls were dry near the entrance, but showed signs of moisture deeper in dark streaks where water had run in some distant past. And on the floor near what would have been the high water mark, Hannah saw something that made her breath catch. A ring of stones deliberately placed, forming a circle about 3 feet across. In the center, old charcoal and ash, long cold but unmistakable. Someone had built a fire here. Someone had sheltered in this place and survived. The match burned down to her fingers. She dropped it and lit another. Clara had already moved deeper into the cave, drawn by something Hannah could not yet see. When she caught up, she understood. In a small alcove carved into the wall by water and time, someone had left offerings, a stone axe, its edge still sharp despite unknown years. Several coils of sinew cord dried but intact. A piece of tan leather folded and preserved by the constant temperature and low humidity of the cave. These were not random objects. They were tools left behind by people who had known this place, who had used it and valued it, and perhaps returned to it season after season. The Ute people had lived in these mountains for centuries before the miners came. This cave had been their shelter, their sanctuary, and now it would be Hannah and Clara's. The match died. Hannah lit a third, her last, before they would need to conserve the tin for emergencies. By its light, they explored further. The passage opened after another 30 yards into a chamber that took Hannah's breath away. It was massive, a natural cathedral carved from living stone. The ceiling soared overhead, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the matchlight. But high above, Hannah could see a faint gray glow, a column of dim light falling from some opening in the rock. Snow fell through that opening, but it did not reach the floor. It melted in the air, turning to mist and vanishing before it could touch the ground. The floor of the chamber was cool but not frozen. Hannah knelt and placed her bare palm against the stone. It felt like the floor of a root cellar in summer, that deep, persistent coolness and that never quite became cold. Geothermal warming. Her father's textbook had been right. The earth itself was keeping this place alive. Clara stood beside her, and for the first time since leaving Ezra's cabin, Hannah felt something that was not fear or desperation. She felt recognition. They had not stumbled into shelter by accident. They had arrived at a destination. This cave, this breathing stone, this place the world had forgotten, this was where they belonged. The match went out. They stood in darkness, broken only by the faint gray light from the fissure overhead. Hannah's voice was quiet but steady. "We're not dying here." Clara's hand found hers and the dark fingers lacing together. "No, we're not." They had no illusions about what lay ahead. Survival would require everything they had learned, every scrap of knowledge gleaned from their father's books and their mother's gardening wisdom. They would need to build shelter within shelter, find water, create warmth, grow food in a place where nothing should grow. The work would be brutal and unrelenting. The margin for error would be non-existent. But they had been preparing for this their entire lives without knowing it. Every book they had read, every principle they had memorized, every experiment they had conducted in Ezra's garden, all of it had been training for this moment. They had been building towards something, and now they knew what it was. Hannah thought of the small tin of seeds Clara carried wrapped in oiled cloth in the flour sack. Lettuce, radishes, carrots, hardy greens that could tolerate low light and cool temperatures. She thought of the sourdough starter kept alive against all odds, a living link to their mother's kitchen. She thought of the tools left behind in the alcove, the knowledge encoded in her father's books, the understanding of soil and stone, and the patient rhythms of growth. They had been cast out because they were different, because their minds worked in ways that frightened people who needed the world to remain mysterious and unknowable, because they had dared to look at the earth and see not a divine puzzle, but a comprehensible system, not magic, but mechanics. The people of Black Ridge Hollow had wanted them gone, had needed them gone to preserve the comfortable boundaries of their understanding. They had closed the door and clicked the latch and pointed toward the killing cold of the mountain pass. They had delivered a verdict they believed was final. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed that exile was the same as execution. They had confused being cast out with being destroyed. They had not accounted for the possibility that the thing they feared, that quiet, unsettling competence, that strange unity of purpose, was exactly the quality required to transform a limestone cave into a home. Hannah released Clara's hand and opened her flour sack. She pulled out one of the books, feeling its familiar weight and shape in the darkness. Tomorrow they would begin the real work. They would explore every passage of this cave system map, every chamber, find the water source she knew must exist somewhere in these tunnels. They would build a cabin beneath a fissure where the light fell, construct a hearth and chimney using the natural vent in the rock. They would plant their seeds in soil carried up from the valley floor, mixed with the rich guano they would scrape from the high ledges where bats roosted. They would do all of this because the alternative was death, and death was no longer acceptable. Not after coming this far, not after surviving the storm and finding this place, not after finally understanding what they were meant to do. The cave was not a tomb, it was a laboratory, a proving ground, a space where they could finally work without judgment, without fear, without the constant weight of other people's incomprehension pressing down on them like that low gray sky. Clara had already begun gathering dry wood from the cave floor, ancient twigs and branches carried in by floods long ago and preserved by the constant environment. She arranged them in the stone circle left by the Ute building, the foundation of their first fire. Hannah knelt beside her and struck a match, holding it to the driest tinder. The flame caught, grew, spread. Yellow light pushed back the darkness, revealing the soaring walls of their new home. The smoke rose in a thin column drawn upward by the natural chimney of the fissure, disappearing into the night above. Outside, the storm raged on. Snow piled against the entrance to the cave, sealing them in, sealing the world out. By morning, the pass would be impassable. Anyone who had tried to cross it tonight would be dead, frozen in drifts 20 feet deep. The town of Black Ridge Hollow would be cut off, isolated, left to face the winter with whatever supplies they had managed to gather. But here in the breathing stone, two sisters sat by a small fire and felt warmth return to their hands and faces. They were alive, they were together, and they had work to do. The sound of the wind outside was like a voice howling and raging, demanding entry. But the stone did not listen to wind. The stone breathed at its own pace, slow and patient and eternal. And for the first time in their lives, Hannah and Clara Thorne breathed with it. They slept that night in shifts, when always awake to tend the fire, to listen for dangers they could not yet name. The flames cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls, transforming the static stone into something alive and fluid. Hannah took the first watch, sitting with her back against the cave wall, her father's geological survey open on her lap. She could not read the words in the firelight, but she did not need to. She had memorized the relevant passages months ago. Limestone caves of sufficient depth often exhibit remarkable thermal stability, maintaining temperatures between 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. This phenomenon results from the insulating properties of overlying rock, and in some cases geothermal heating from deeper substrata. Such caves have historically served as refuge for both wildlife and human populations during the periods of climatic extremity. The passage had seemed academic when she first read it, interesting but abstract. Now it was the difference between life and death. Every word had weight, every principle had immediate visceral application. When dawn came, it announced itself not with direct sunlight, but with a gradual brightening of the gray column that fell through the fissure overhead. The snow had stopped at some point in the night, and now pale morning light filtered down, illuminating the chamber in a soft, diffused glow. Clara woke without needing to be called, her internal clock perfectly synchronized with the changing light. They ate sparingly, a small piece of the dried venison, a bite of the black bread. Their supplies would last perhaps 3 days if they were careful, a week if they were willing to go hungry. After that, they would need to have established some other source of sustenance. The exploration of the cave system began immediately after the meager breakfast. They left the fire burning. Fuel was abundant enough in the accumulated deadwood on the cave floor and moved deeper into the mountain, carrying a burning brand for light. The main chamber connected to at least 4 other passages. 2 were dead ends terminating in walls of solid limestone after 30 or 40 yards. The third angled sharply downward the floor, becoming slick with moisture, the air growing noticeably warmer. This was the geothermal source. Hannah realized, the deep heat rising from whatever volcanic remnant lay beneath the mountain. They marked it for later exploration, but did not descend. Not yet. The fourth passage was the treasure. It ran level for perhaps 100 feet before opening into a smaller chamber where water dripped steadily from a crack in the ceiling, pooling in a shallow basin that had been carved by millennia of patient erosion. The water was clear and cold, tasting faintly of minerals, but entirely clean. Hannah cupped her hands and drank deeply, the first truly satisfying drink since leaving Ezra's cabin. The relief was almost painful. Clara knelt beside the pool and examined the stone basin. Someone had worked this, she said, running her fingers over the smooth depression. This isn't natural. Not entirely. Hannah looked closer and saw she was right. The basin showed signs of deliberate shaping, subtle modifications to the natural depression to increase its capacity and improve drainage. The Ute had not just used this cave. They had improved it, had understood its systems well enough to make careful interventions that enhanced rather than disrupted its function. The realization was both humbling and encouraging. They were not the first to see this place as more than temporary shelter. They were not the first to recognize its potential. And if others had lived here, had thrived here enough to invest labor in improvements, then survival was not just possible, it was proven. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the remaining passages, mapping the cave system in their minds with the precision that had always unsettled others. Hannah counted steps, estimated ceiling heights, noted the locations of airflow and water seepage. Claire examined the floor and walls for signs of previous habitation, for clues about how the space had been used and what resources it might offer. By midday, they had a complete mental inventory. The cave system consisted of 1 large central chamber, the cathedral space beneath the fissure, 3 smaller chambers, including the one with the water source, and roughly a dozen passages of varying lengths and configurations. Total inhabitable space approximately 3,000 square feet, spread across multiple levels and connected by passages that range from easily walkable to requiring careful navigation. The central chamber was the obvious location for their primary shelter. It had light ventilation and enough space to build a proper structure. The water chamber would serve as their well and potentially as a washing area. The warm lower passage could be developed into something else, though they had not yet determined what. The work of building began that afternoon. The valley outside the cave mouth contained a wealth of fallen timber, perfectly seasoned by years of sun and wind. The trees had been killed by some past fire, their wood dried to an ideal state for construction. But cutting and moving logs with only a small hand axe and a stone blade would be impossible. Hannah solved the first problem by remembering something Jonas Pike had told her 3 months earlier. The town blacksmith was a man of few words but deep practical knowledge. He had noticed Hannah examining the iron fittings on a wagon at Henderson's store, had seen the way she studied the joinery and welds. He had approached her later away from the crowd and handed her a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Tools, he had said, his voice gruff. Your father fixed my best hammer once. Never charged me. Figure I owe him this. Inside had been a small axe, perfectly balanced, its edge sharp enough to shave with, and a knife narrow-bladed and strong, suitable for fine work. Hannah had hidden them in her room, unsure what they meant, uncertain whether accepting them would cause trouble for the blacksmith. Now she understood. Jonas had known. Somehow he had seen what was coming and had given them the means to survive it. The axe made the work possible. Hannah and Clara took turns, one chopping while the other rested. They did not try to fell standing trees that would have been beyond their strength, but instead selected logs from the deadfall, cutting them to manageable lengths. The work was brutal, their hands blistered within the first hour, the soft skin tearing and bleeding. But they did not stop. By the second day, they had dragged 12 logs into the main chamber. By the fourth day, they had 20. The logs were not large, 8 to 10 inches in diameter, most of them, but they were sound and dry. Clara, working from a technique she had seen described in one of their father's agricultural bulletins, showed Hannah how to notch the ends so they would interlock, creating a stable structure without the need for nails or binding. The cabin took shape, slowly rising log by log beneath the fissure in the ceiling. They built it small, just large enough for 2 people to sleep and store supplies. 12 feet by 10 feet with a ceiling height of 7 feet at the peak. The walls were solid gaps chinked with clay they dug from the banks of the underground stream and mixed with dried grass carried in from outside. For the roof, they used the tanned leather they had found in the alcove, supplemented with additional hides they created by catching and processing rabbits that ventured near the cave entrance. The roof was not beautiful, but it was functional, shedding the condensation that formed on the cave ceiling and directing it away from the living space. The stone hearth was the most challenging construction. They built it against the back wall of the cabin, positioning it directly beneath a natural crack in the cave ceiling that served as a chimney. The stones had to be selected carefully for size and shape, fitted together with clay mortar, and arranged so that smoke would draw upward without backdrafting into the cabin. Hannah worked from principles she had read in her father's books, but reading about thermodynamics was different from building a functional fireplace with nothing but river stones and determination. The first attempt failed, filling the cabin with choking smoke. The second worked better, but still leaked. The third, built with modifications suggested by careful observation of how air moved through the cave system, drew perfectly. When the fire was finally burning clean and hot in the completed hearth, Clara sat back on her heels and laughed. The sound was startling in the enclosed space, rare enough that Hannah looked up in surprise. But there was nothing mocking in the laughter, nothing bitter. It was pure relief. The sound of a problem solved a system that worked. They celebrated by baking their first loaf of bread. The sourdough starter had survived its journey, kept alive by the constant cool temperature of the cave and daily feedings of the precious flour. Clara mixed the dough by firelight, her hands moving with the same unconscious grace she had learned from their mother. She shaped the loaf, let it rise in a bowl covered with cloth, then set it on a flat stone they had positioned in the hottest part of the hearth. The smell of baking bread filled the cabin first, then drifted out to fill the entire main chamber. It was a scent that had no business existing in a limestone cave in the middle of a Colorado winter. But there it was, the fundamental aroma of civilization, of home, of human ingenuity triumphing over raw nature. When the loaf was done, they split it between them. The crust was dark and hard, the interior dense and chewy. It was not the finest bread either of them had ever eaten, but it was the most important. It was proof that they could not just survive, but create, could not just endure, but build something new. The garden came next. In the lower chamber, where the geothermal warmth was strongest, they hauled soil. The work took a week. They would go out into the valley on days when the weather permitted, dig black earth from beneath the snow, load it into the flour sacks, and carry it back up to the cave. Trip after trip, their backs aching, their legs trembling with exhaustion. They mixed the soil with bat guano scraped from high ledges, creating a growing medium rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. In wooden troughs they constructed from split logs, they planted the seeds Clara had saved: lettuce, radishes, carrots, hardy greens that could tolerate cool temperatures and low light. The first shoots appeared 3 weeks after planting, tiny spears of green pushing through the dark soil. In the dim light of oil lamps they had fashioned from rendered rabbit fat and twisted cloth wicks, Those first greens looked almost alien, too bright and vivid to be real. But they were real. They were alive, and they were growing. By late January, when the Blackridge Hollow was buried under 4 feet of snow and temperatures regularly plunged to 20 below zero, Clara harvested their first radish. It was small and pale, nothing like the robust red globes that grew in summer gardens. But it was firm and crisp, and when they washed it in the cold water of the underground stream and split it between them, the sharp, peppery bite was a taste of impossible victory. They had not merely survived the storm, they had bent the world to accommodate them. They had taken a dark hole in the mountain and transformed it into a place where life could exist, could flourish in defiance of every natural law that said it should not. The sound of that radish snapping between Hannah's teeth was louder in the silence of the cave than any sermon Reverend Crane had ever delivered. It was a statement of facts simple and irrefutable. We are here. We are alive. We are not going anywhere. The hunter appeared on a morning when frost painted the cave entrance white, and the world outside lay silent under fresh snow. Hannah saw him first, a shadow moving at the tree line, picking his way through drifts with the careful economy of someone who spent more time in wilderness than in town. She recognized the gait before she could make out the face Finn Whitaker, 16 years old, carrying a brace of snowshoe hares and moving with the focused intensity of someone tracking prey. He stopped at the dark mouth of the cave silhouetted against the white landscape and stood perfectly still for a long moment. Hannah watched from inside her hand, resting on the axe handle, calculating distances and angles. Then Finn took 3 steps forward and knelt, placing the hares on a flat stone just inside the threshold. He backed away without entering, without calling out, and disappeared into the trees. Clara appeared at Hannah's shoulder, the boy from the trap lines. Hannah nodded. The people of Blackridge Hollow called Finn simple, slow-witted, because he rarely spoke and seemed to process the world at a different rhythm than others. But Hannah had watched him at the general store, had seen the way his eyes tracked patterns in wood grain and the flight paths of birds, had noticed how he could predict weather changes days in advance by reading signs invisible to everyone else. He was not simple, he was fluent in a language most people could not speak. The hares were still warm, freshly killed, and cleanly gutted. Hannah examined them in the growing light and found the work professional precise. No wasted motion, no torn meat. These were the offerings of someone who understood the value of what he had and wanted it respected. 2 days later, Finn returned. This time, Hannah was outside checking the deadfall trap she had set for rabbits. She stood slowly when he emerged from the trees, making no sudden movements. He carried no weapon she could see, just a canvas pack slung over one shoulder. He stopped at a respectful distance. His voice when he finally spoke was quiet, each word considered before being released. I followed a hare here, found the valley, found this place. Hannah said nothing, waiting. Your fire smoke smells different. Not pine, juniper, and something else. Mesquite, maybe, from the lower valley. Still Hannah waited, understanding that Finn was building to something, that he needed to say things in his own order and time. The town thinks you're dead. Reverend says it's God's judgment. But I've been trapping in these mountains for 3 years. I know where the dead things end up. You're not among them. Are you going to tell them? Finn shifted his pack, considering the question with visible seriousness. Finally, he shook his head. They wouldn't believe me anyway. And even if they did, he trailed off his gaze, moving past Hannah to the cave entrance, to the thin thread of smoke rising from somewhere inside. What you're doing here, it's important. He could not have explained what he meant by important, could not have articulated the recognition he felt looking at their impossible survival. But Hannah understood. Finn saw the world as a set of interlocking systems cause flowing into effect patterns repeating across scales. He recognized in their work the same quality he brought to his trap lines, the patient application of knowledge, the respect for natural law, the willingness to learn from failure and iterate towards success. The trading began that day. 2 hares for a bunch of radishes that should not exist. A cured beaver pelt for bread that had no business being baked in a cave. Finn became their connection to the world they had left, carrying their furs on the 2-day trek to Silver Creek, the next town over, where no one knew the Thorne sisters, and questions were not asked. He returned with flour, salt, lamp oil, more seeds. He never asked how they afforded these things. The furs spoke for themselves. Osals. Hannah had become skilled at preparing skins using techniques she had found in her father's collection of frontier guides, mixing her own tanning solutions from oak bark and animal brains. The quality of her work was high enough that the traders in Silver Creek paid premium prices, no questions asked, about who had done the labor. Through Finn, they learned about the winter that had sealed Black Ridge Hollow. The blizzards had come in waves, each one dumping another 2 feet of snow before the previous accumulation could settle. The road to the outside world had become impassable by mid-December. By January, the town was an island cut off, completely left to survive on whatever supplies had been laid in during autumn. Those supplies had not been sufficient. Finn reported shortages, rationing families eating nothing but cornmeal mush and salted pork for weeks at a time. And then the influenza arrived, spreading from household to household, with vicious efficiency hitting the malnourished especially hard. He told them these things without editorial comment, simply conveying information he thought they should have. Hannah listened and filed the details away, noting the progression of events, the cascade of consequences that had been set in motion when the first door closed and the first latch clicked. February brought a visitor they had not expected. Finn arrived one afternoon with someone else, a figure moving slowly through the deep snow, clearly struggling with the terrain. When they got close enough, Hannah recognized Jonas Pike the blacksmith, who had given her the tools that had made survival possible. Jonas stood at the cave entrance, breathing hard, his single arm supporting his weight against the stone. His empty left sleeve was pinned neatly at the shoulder, the fabric worn smooth from years of use. He looked older than Hannah remembered, the lines in his face carved deeper, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He scanned the cave mouth, the stacked firewood, the carefully maintained path leading inside. His gaze lingered on Hannah's hands, noting the calluses, the heel blisters, the evidence of hard labor. When he spoke, his voice carried no surprise, only confirmation of something he had already suspected. "Your father was my friend. Before the typhoid, we worked together on the mine ventilation systems. He was the smartest man I ever knew." Hannah nodded, unsure what response was expected. "He told me once that his daughters had his mind. Said it troubled him knowing what the town would do with that. People don't like smart women. Smart women who don't need anyone else, that scares them even more." Jonas shifted his weight, reaching into his coat pocket with his remaining hand. He pulled out a rolled bundle of paper tied with twine. "A geological survey, newer than the one in my pack. Published last year. Thought you might want it." Hannah took the bundle, feeling the weight of it, understanding the gift being offered. New information, new knowledge, tools as valuable as the axe he had given her. "I also brought these." He nodded toward the large pack Finn was carrying. Nails, wire, a small handsaw, some things you can't make from stone and sinew. "Why are you helping us?" Jonas met her eyes directly. "Because you're doing something that matters. Because the town made a choice, and I don't agree with it. Because I'm too old to care what Reverend Crane thinks about who I give my tools to." He stayed for an hour examining their construction work with a builder's critical eye, suggesting modifications to the chimney design that would improve draft, showing Clara a better way to seal the gaps in their cabin walls using moss and clay. Then he prepared to leave, pulling his coat tight against the cold. "I'll come back in spring if I can manage it. Bring more supplies. Maybe some chickens if you can keep them alive in here." "We'll find a way." Jonas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I expect you will." After he left, Hannah unrolled the geological survey and found more than maps. Tucked inside were detailed drawings of root cellars, spring houses, and underground storage systems. Practical knowledge encoded in clean technical diagrams. Jonas had given them a blueprint for expansion, for transformation, from mere survival to something approaching sustainable habitation. The weeks that followed brought steady work. They extended the garden chambers, building more growing troughs, experimenting with different configurations to maximize the limited light. Clara discovered that certain herbs thrived in the cave environment, particularly those that preferred shade and constant moisture. She started a collection mint parsley thyme plants that added flavor to their simple meals and could be dried for trade. The cabin became more than a shelter. They built shelves along the walls, organizing their supplies with the same systematic precision they brought to everything. The books occupied the highest shelf, protected from moisture. Tools hung on pegs, each one positioned for easy access. Clay pots stored seeds, dried herbs, rendered fat. The space was small but meticulously ordered, every object in its proper place, everything serving multiple functions where possible. Hannah developed a routine of daily observation, walking the cave system each morning and evening, noting changes in temperature, airflow, moisture levels. She began to understand the cave as a living system responsive to external conditions, but governed by its own internal logic. When surface temperatures dropped, the lower passages grew slightly warmer as heat rose from the geothermal source. When snow melted rapidly outside, water flow through the upper chambers increased. The patterns were subtle but consistent, and consistency made them predictable. Predictability made them useful. Hannah learned to read the cave the way sailors read the sea, looking for signs and portents that could inform decisions. She discovered that certain passages could serve as natural refrigeration, staying cold enough to preserve meat. Others, warmed by rising air from below, were ideal for drying herbs and curing skins. The cave was not just shelter, it was infrastructure waiting to be understood and utilized. One night in early March, they heard sounds from deep in the cave system. Low rumbling that resonated through the stone, lasting several minutes before fading. Hannah grabbed a lamp and descended into the lower passages, following the sound to its source. What she found made her pulse quicken, with equal parts fear and excitement. A section of passage wall had collapsed, revealing a chamber they had not known existed. The space was smaller than the main cathedral, but still substantial, perhaps 20 feet across and twice that in length. And it was warm. Not cool like the rest of the cave, but genuinely warm, the air almost humid. Hannah held her hand near the floor and felt heat radiating from the stone itself. This was the geothermal source she had theorized about, closer to the surface than she had expected, accessible now through the collapse. The chamber was too hot for growing food. The temperature had to be close to 80 degrees, but it opened other possibilities. They could use this heat channel, it distributed to the chambers above through carefully designed air passages. Clara joined her an hour later, drawn by Hannah's extended absence. Together they stood in the warm chamber, feeling sweat form on their skin for the first time since entering the cave. Clara's voice was thoughtful, already working through applications. We could dry meat here, cure cheese if we ever get milk, keep water from freezing, or we could warm the growing chambers, extend the season even further. They spent the next week experimenting, carefully opening small passages between the warm chamber and the spaces above, learning how to regulate airflow to distribute heat without creating dangerous temperature gradients. The work required patience and constant adjustment, but the results justified the effort. The temperature in their primary growing chamber rose by 15 degrees, bringing it to an almost perfect 65. The greens responded immediately, growing faster, producing larger leaves. By mid-March, they had a surplus, more food than two people could consume, more than they needed for seed saving and crop rotation. The surplus represented a decision point. They could store it, preserving against future scarcity, or they could trade it, converting their excess into other resources they still lacked. The decision was made for them when Finn arrived, looking grim, his usual stoic expression cracked by visible distress. The town is dying. The influenza had burned through Blackridge Hollow like fire through dry timber, hitting hardest where malnutrition had already weakened immune systems. 3 children dead, 2 elderly, Reverend Crane's wife bedridden and not expected to survive. And the food situation had gone from scarce to desperate. Finn would not have come if it had not been serious. He understood their situation, understood the risk of drawing attention. But hunger had stripped away pretense, leaving only raw need. Can you spare anything? Bread, greens, anything. I can pay. People have traded me what they can. Hannah looked at their stores. The bread cooling on the stone oven, the baskets of greens from the latest harvest, the dried herbs hanging from the cabin rafters. What they had was not much in absolute terms, but measured against the town's desperation, it was wealth. How many are sick? More than half the families. The ones who aren't sick are too weak to help the ones who are. Clara had already begun moving wrapping loaves of bread in clean cloth, bundling greens, measuring dried herbs into small sacks. She worked without hesitation, without calculation, simply seeing a need and meeting it. This was the language she understood: growth, nourishment, care. The political implications were someone else's problem. But Hannah understood those implications perfectly. Once they started feeding the town, they could not easily stop. Once Blackridge Hollow knew they were alive and producing food, the relationship would change. The town had cast them out. Now the town needed them. That reversal created leverage, but it also created obligation. Tell them. Her voice was steady, measured the tone of someone issuing logistics instructions rather than making an emotional decision. Tell them we're alive. Tell them we can help. But make it clear this is trade, not charity. We're not coming back. This is business. Finn nodded, understanding the distinction. He loaded his pack with the supplies, staggering slightly under the weight. Before he left, he turned back. They're going to ask questions about how you're doing this, where the food comes from. You can tell them we built a greenhouse in a cave using geothermal heat and careful agriculture. See if they believe you. They won't. No, but they'll eat the food anyway. The trading network that emerged over the following weeks was built on practical need rather than reconciliation. Families sent requests through Finn. A sick child needed broth. A new mother needed greens to restore her strength. An elderly man with no teeth needed soft bread. They sent payment in whatever they could spare: a few coins, a bag of oats, a bolt of cloth, information about what was happening in the wider world. Hannah and Clara never saw their customers directly. Finn served as intermediary carrier and diplomat. He made the 2-day round trip twice a week, his sled laden with food going down the mountain and returning with payment and new requests. The system worked because it was simple and because everyone involved had strong incentive to maintain it. The town needed food. The sisters needed supplies and the implicit protection that came from being useful. Finn needed purpose and the satisfaction of solving a complex logistical puzzle. The arrangement had nothing to do with forgiveness or reconciliation. It was pure transaction, cleaned of sentiment, reduced to its functional essence. But not everyone in Blackridge Hollow was willing to accept transaction as a substitute for judgment. Reverend Crane had spent the winter watching his congregation suffer, had presided over funerals for children who had starved and frozen, had held his dying wife's hand while praying for deliverance that had not come. The arrival of food from an impossible source felt to him not like salvation, but like accusation. Finn reported the Reverend's response to the first delivery: "This bread is an affront to God. It comes from darkness and unnaturalness. We will not eat abomination to preserve our bodies while damning our souls." And did he eat it? Finn's expression answered before his words did. He ate it, but he made his family pray over it for an hour first. The contradiction would have been funny if it had not been so predictable. Crane needed to maintain his moral authority even as physical need forced him to compromise. The solution was to accept the food while condemning its source to benefit from the sisters' work, while insisting it remained sinful. It was a position that could not survive sustained examination, but examination required energy that starving people did not have. Not everyone shared Crane's ambivalence. Mr. Henderson, the general store owner, sent a note with Finn. "Your bread kept my family alive. If you need anything from my inventory, consider it yours, no charge." It was the closest thing to an apology Hannah expected to receive, and it came from a man whose practical concerns outweighed his ideology. Henderson understood commerce, understood value created and value exchanged. The sisters produced something useful. The mechanism of production was irrelevant to the quality of the product. Others sent similar acknowledgments. Brief notes thanking them for soup that had broken a fever, for greens that had restored color to a child's cheeks, for bread that had simply tasted like something other than hardship and desperation. The notes were not apologies for the exile. They were payments of a different kind, social currency that acknowledged debt without requiring the creditors to forgive the debtors. Hannah collected the notes in a wooden box, not out of sentiment, but as documentation. If the relationship ever turned hostile again, evidence of gratitude might serve as protection. Trust could not be rebuilt, but dependency could be leveraged. The notes were proof of dependency. The warm weather arrived gradually, the deep snows giving way to slush and then to exposed ground. By early April, the pass was navigable again, and Black Ridge Hollow reconnected with the outside world. Supply wagons arrived, bringing flour, salt pork, and news of a wider world that had continued turning, while the valley lay frozen and isolated. The town's need for the cave's production diminished with the arrival of outside supplies, but it did not disappear. The greens from the cave garden were fresher than anything that could be shipped. The bread was better than what the general store sold, and the herbs had medicinal properties that the town doctor, a weary man named Hastings, found genuinely valuable. Dr. Hastings came himself in May, hiking up to the cave with Finn as guide. He was a practical man in his 50s, trained in Philadelphia before the California gold rush had drawn him west. He had seen too much suffering to waste time on judgment. When Hannah showed him the growing chambers, explained the geothermal system, and the careful management of temperature and humidity, he listened with the focused attention of someone encountering professional work in an unexpected context. You understand what you've created here is medically significant. The herbs alone grown under these controlled conditions have a purity and potency I rarely see, but it's the system itself that's remarkable. Year-round production, stable environment, protection from pests and weather. This is agriculture as it should be practiced, not as it usually is. Hannah accepted the compliment with a slight nod. We work with what we have. Most people work against what they have. You're the exception. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. The town made a mistake with you. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but mistakes create opportunities for those willing to see them. You've built something here that could teach the whole valley new methods, new possibilities. We're not interested in teaching. Not now, perhaps, but people have short memories for their own cruelty and long memories for their own need. Give it time. He left them with a standing order for specific herbs and a promise to send any medical text he thought might interest them. The relationship was professional, transactional, exactly what Hannah preferred. Dr. Hastings wanted reliable suppliers for his medicine. The sisters wanted access to medical knowledge and a steady customer. Both parties benefited. No reconciliation required. June brought Jonas Pike back as promised. He arrived with 2 crates strapped to a pack mule, one containing 6 young chickens, the other filled with wire mesh hand tools, and a small bag of vegetable seeds he had ordered special from a catalog. Also included was a book, its cover embossed with gold lettering, Advanced Techniques in Sustainable Agriculture, by Luther Burbank. The chickens were a gamble. Birds needed light, fresh air space to move. The cave could provide some of these things, but not all. Hannah and Clara spent a week constructing a coop in one of the upper chambers, positioning it near a secondary fissure that admitted natural light. They scattered soil on the floor, planted quick-growing greens for the birds to peck at established water and feeding stations. The chickens adapted with surprising speed. Within a month, they were laying regularly, providing eggs that transformed the sisters' diet and gave them another valuable trade good. The birds seemed content in their strange environment, possibly more so than they would have been in a traditional outdoor co-op, where predators and weather posed constant threats. Jonas visited monthly through the summer, each time bringing new supplies and carrying away furs, herbs, and whatever excess production the cave generated. He never stayed long. His work in town demanded his presence, but the visits established a rhythm, a predictable connection to the world beyond the cave. During one visit, he mentioned something that made Hannah's attention sharpen. A man came through town last week. Scholar type from back east. Boston, I think, asking questions about the old mine surveys, about geological formations in the area. Said his name was Holloway, Dr. Samuel Holloway. The name meant nothing to Hannah, but the description triggered recognition. A scholar interested in geological formations would know about cave systems, about geothermal phenomena. Such a person might want to study what they had found, might see their cave as a research opportunity rather than a home. Did you tell him anything? Jonas's expression remained neutral. Told him the surveys were a decade out of date, and most of the interesting formations were on the other side of the range. Seemed to satisfy him. Thank you. Your father's surveys are your property. Seemed wrong to share them without asking first. The incident passed without further consequence, but it planted a seed of awareness. Their isolation was not permanent. The cave could be discovered by others, could be claimed or studied or disrupted by people with resources and authority they lacked. Protection required obscurity, and obscurity required vigilance. By autumn, the cave had become something approaching a homestead. The cabin had been expanded, gaining a second room for storage and work. The growing chambers now produced reliable yields of vegetables and herbs across multiple seasons. The chicken coop hummed with activity. Systems for water management, heat distribution, and waste disposal had been refined through iteration and observation. Most significantly, the sisters had developed expertise. They understood their environment with an intimacy that went beyond book knowledge, had learned its rhythms, and responded to its signals. They could predict when chambers would flood based on snowmelt patterns. They knew which passages to avoid during temperature inversions. They had mapped every useful resource within a mile of the cave entrance. This expertise made them valuable in ways that went beyond food production. When a rancher 3 valleys over lost his entire potato crop, to blight, Dr. Hastings suggested he consult with the Thorne sisters about disease-resistant varieties. When a mining engineer needed advice on managing water infiltration and shaft construction, Jonas Pike mentioned that he knew someone with extensive knowledge of limestone hydrology. The consultations were conducted remotely through Finn or Jonas or written correspondence. Hannah would receive a description of a problem, would consider it against her accumulated knowledge, and would send back recommendations. The solutions were usually correct. Her reputation as someone who understood systems began to spread quietly through the network of practical people who valued results over social convention. By the winter of 1874, a year after their exile, the cave had become more than their home. It had become the center of a web of relationships built on competence and mutual benefit. The town still whispered about unnatural knowledge and divine judgment, but the whispers were quieter now, muffled by the practical acknowledgement that the Thorne sisters produced value. Reverend Crane still preached against them, still warned about the spiritual danger of accepting help from darkness. But his congregation's attention wandered during those sermons, distracted by memories of the previous winter's hunger and the knowledge that another hard season was coming. Ideology was a luxury. Survival was necessity. The transformation was not reconciliation. The door that had closed would never fully reopen. But a new door had been built, one that led not to acceptance but to coexistence. The town and the cave maintained separate spheres that intersected only at points of transaction. It was not friendship, but it was sustainable. In December, as the first serious snows began to fall, a figure appeared at the cave entrance, carrying a burden heavier than any pack could hold. Finn came first, breaking trail through knee-deep powder, and behind him stumbled Ezra Thorne. Hannah's uncle had diminished. The man who had stood solid and resolute in his doorway 13 months earlier had been hollowed out by time and guilt in a winter that had taken more from him than physical comfort. He moved like someone twice his age, each step a negotiation with exhaustion. His beard was shot through with gray that had not been there before. His eyes would not lift from the ground. Finn stopped at the cave mouth. He didn't send me. I offered to guide him after I saw his condition. He's been sick. Not influenza. Something else. Something inside. Ezra stood 20 feet back, swaying slightly in the wind. He still had not looked up, had not acknowledged Hannah's presence directly. When he finally spoke, the words came out rough, scraped raw by something that had been eating at him for months. The Miller family, Reverend Crane's household, his wife, the children, all four of them down with fever, the youngest the baby. They don't think she'll last the night. The wind howled through the valley carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Hannah looked at the man who had sent them into that wind a year ago, had handed them flour sacks and pointed toward death, had chosen the comfort of community over the obligation of blood. She felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a flat recognition of cause producing effect, of choices generating consequences. Clara had already moved, disappearing into the cabin. Hannah could hear her working, the sound of the oven door opening, the rustle of dried herbs being selected from their storage bundles. Her sister was not deliberating. She was simply responding to information about a sick child the way a doctor responds to a wound. The politics of who that child's father was did not enter the calculation. How many others are sick? Ezra's shoulders hunched further inward. 20 families, maybe more. The fever hits hard. We don't have medicine, don't have much of anything except what you've been sending through Finn. Hannah studied her uncle's defeated posture, the way he held himself as if expecting to be struck. She understood in that moment that he had already delivered the harshest judgment possible. Whatever punishment she might inflict would be redundant. The man had been living in his choice for a year, had watched it play out in hunger and sickness, in the cold mathematics of survival. He knew exactly what he had done. The question was not whether to help. Clara had already decided that. The question was what helping would mean, what docker it would open or close, what relationship it would establish between the cave and the town. Clara emerged carrying a heavy basket, 2 loaves of bread still warm from the stone oven wrapped in cloth, a clay jar of concentrated vegetable broth thick enough to spoon, 3 bundles of dried herbs, each carefully labeled with preparation instructions in Hannah's precise handwriting, and a smaller package wrapped separately, willow bark and elderberry, the closest thing they had to fever medicine. She placed the basket at the cave entrance and stepped back. Ezra moved forward slowly as if approaching something sacred or dangerous, possibly both. His hands trembled as he reached for the basket. Then he stopped, and from inside his worn coat, he pulled out a small leather-bound book. The cover was scuffed and faded, the pages softened by years of handling. Hannah recognized it before he extended it toward her, their mother's sketchbook filled with drawings of wildflowers and cloud formations and the sleeping faces of infant daughters. This belongs with you. His fingers brushed against hers as he transferred the book, the first physical contact between them in over a year. His skin was cold rough with calluses, shaking slightly from more than just the temperature. For one brief moment, a question passed between them unspoken, but understood. Is this enough? Can this small gesture balance the weight of what happened? The answer was no, and they both knew it. The book could not undo Exile. It could not erase the memory of a closed door and a clicking latch. But it was what Ezra had to offer, the only apology he knew how to give. And perhaps that was the point. Not that it was sufficient, but that it was genuine, scraped up from whatever was left of the man after guilt had finished carving him hollow. Hannah took the book without speaking. Ezra lifted the basket, his remaining strength barely equal to its weight, and turned to follow Finn back down the mountain. He moved like a prisoner, carrying his own sentence bent under more than physical burden. Clara watched him go. Her voice was quiet, clinical, empty of judgment or emotion. He looked sick. Hannah nodded. Not influenza, not anything you can cure with herbs. The diagnosis was heart failure, but not the kind doctors treated with digitalis. This was a failure of the essential organ that kept a person upright in the world, the internal structure that allowed them to meet their own reflection without flinching. They stood in the cave entrance, watching 2 figures grow smaller against the white landscape, watching until they disappeared into the tree line and were gone. The wind continued its relentless work, erasing footprints, covering tracks, smoothing the snow into unmarked perfection as if no one had passed this way at all. Hannah opened the sketchbook to a random page. Her mother's handwriting annotated a drawing of columbine flowers. Rocky Mountain species blooms late May, prefers shade, and consistent moisture attracts hummingbirds. The notes were precise, observational, focused on understanding rather than admiring. Looking at them, Hannah saw where she and Clara had come from, saw the template that had shaped them long before Exile had refined them. The next delivery went out through Finn 3 days later, enough food and medicine to supply 20 families for a week. Payment came back in the form of chickens, 3 laying hens that Henderson had purchased from a farm in the next valley over. Also included was a bag of salt, a spool of copper wire, and a note in the store owner's blocky handwriting: "The town owes you more than this, but it's what we have right now." The winter of 1874 to 1875 was milder than the previous year, but the town's memory of hunger remained sharp. They came to depend on the cave's production, not out of desperation, but out of recognition that it offered something their own efforts could not match: consistency, quality, reliability. The greens from the geothermal chambers were always fresh. The bread was always good. The herbs were always potent. Jonas brought news of changing attitudes. People talk different now. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. You've become part of how things work. They might not like it, but they need it. What about Reverend Crane? Jonas's expression hardened. He's a problem. Probably always will be. But his influence is smaller than it was. People stopped listening after his prayers didn't keep them fed. The Reverend's diminished authority became evident in February when he tried to organize a group to investigate the cave to verify that what was happening there was natural rather than diabolical. 4 men had agreed initially, but by the appointed day, only Crane himself appeared at the meeting point. The others had found excuses: work that needed doing, family that needed tending. The truth was simpler. They no longer cared whether the cave's productivity was natural or supernatural. They cared that it worked. Crane stood alone in the town square for an hour waiting for supporters who never came before finally accepting defeat. The story spread quickly, carried by the same gossip networks that had once condemned the sisters. Now the narrative had shifted. Crane was the zealot disconnected from practical reality. The Thorne sisters were the ones who understood how the world actually functioned. The shift was not complete or universal. Plenty of people still whispered about unnatural knowledge and dark bargains, but the whispers no longer had the weight of consensus behind them. The town had fractured into camps: those who valued practical results, those who prioritized moral purity, and the large middle ground who simply wanted to survive and would take help from wherever it came. Spring brought Dr. Samuel Holloway back to Black Ridge Hollow, but this time he did not ask subtle questions at the general store. He presented himself directly to Jonas Pike and requested an introduction to the Thorne sisters. He explained, come into possession of William Thorne's original geological surveys and had connected certain details in those documents to patterns in the landscape. He believed he understood what was happening in the cave, and he wanted to verify his hypothesis. Jonas carried the message to Hannah without editorial comment. Your call whether to see him. Hannah considered the request for 2 days before agreeing. Holloway represented risk. A scholar from Boston had resources and connections that could threaten their autonomy, but he also represented something else: validation. If his interest was genuine, if he saw scientific value in what they had built, then their work was more than mere survival. It was innovation worthy of study and documentation. Dr. Holloway arrived at the cave on a clear morning in May, accompanied by Jonas, but carrying only a leather satchel and a notebook. He was younger than Hannah had expected, perhaps 45, with the lean build of someone who spent more time thinking than laboring. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, broken in from actual use rather than affectation. He stood at the cave entrance and studied the layout with visible appreciation, his eyes tracking the smoke from the chimney, the neat stack of firewood, the worn but well-maintained path leading inside. Before speaking, he removed his hat, a gesture of respect that Hannah noted and filed away. My name is Samuel Holloway. I'm a geologist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I came to Colorado following your father's research on limestone formations and geothermal systems. His work was ahead of its time. I believe you've proven his theories in ways he never had the chance to attempt. Hannah remained silent, evaluating. Holloway took the silence as permission to continue. I read about what happened here last year. The exile, the winter, the survival. The official story is that you froze to death in the past, but Jonas told me enough to make me curious, and curiosity is my profession. May I see what you've built? The tour took 3 hours. Hannah showed him everything: the geothermal chambers, the growing systems, the water management, the heat distribution network. She explained her modifications to her father's theories, the observations that had led to innovations, the failures that had taught her what not to do. Holloway listened with the focused attention of someone encountering something genuinely new, asking questions that demonstrated both expertise and humility. In the main growing chamber, he knelt to examine the soil mixture, crumbling it between his fingers, bringing it close to his face to smell. This is remarkable. The balance of nutrients, the pH level, the texture. This isn't luck or accident. This is agricultural science practiced at a level I rarely see even in university settings. We read books. We observe, we adjust based on results. Most people read books and think that makes them educated. You've gone further. You've taken theory and made it practical, tested it against reality, refined it through iteration. That's not education, that's mastery. The word hung in the air between them, precise and potentially dangerous. Mastery implied authority, expertise, power. Women were not supposed to master technical domains. They were supposed to be students at best, decorative at worst. For Holloway to use the word was either a genuine assessment or a sophisticated form of flattery. Hannah studied his face, looking for calculation or manipulation. She found neither. What she saw instead was the expression of someone who had spent a career studying systems and recognized excellence when he encountered it, regardless of who produced it. What do you want from us, Dr. Holloway? I want to document this, to write about what you have accomplished here, to publish it in journals where other scientists and engineers can learn from your methods. With your permission, of course. And what do we get from this arrangement? Recognition, validation, protection of a sort. If your work is published and respected in academic circles, it becomes harder for local authorities to interfere with that. Knowledge once shared becomes public property. No one can take that away. Hannah turned to Clara, who had been silent throughout the tour. Her sister's expression was unreadable, but Hannah knew her well enough to interpret the subtle signals. Caution but not refusal, openness to possibility, tempered by skepticism about promises. We'll consider your proposal. Holloway accepted the non-answer with grace. Take all the time you need. I'll be in the area for another 2 weeks staying at Henderson's boarding house. If you decide you're interested, send word through Jonas. Before he left, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a book, its cover embossed with gilt lettering. This is the latest edition of the USDA Agricultural Bulletin. It contains information on crop rotation systems that I think you'd find useful. Consider it a gift, regardless of what you decide about my proposal. The book was valuable, current, exactly the kind of resource they needed. Accepting it created obligation, but refusing it would be wasteful. Hannah took it with a nod that acknowledged both the value and the implied strings attached. After Holloway departed, Hannah and Clara sat in their cabin while firelight played across the walls. They did not discuss the decision immediately. Instead, they performed their evening routines, checking the growing chambers, feeding the chickens, securing supplies for the night. The work gave them time to think, to let the question settle into their minds and be examined from multiple angles. Finally, as they sat with cups of herb tea mint from their own garden, honey from Henderson's store, Clara spoke. If we let him write about this, everyone will know. Not just Blackridge, but beyond. We won't be able to hide anymore. We were never really hiding, just maintaining distance. That distance protected us. Hannah sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Did it? Or did it just delay the inevitable? The inevitable being what? That the world would have to decide what to do with us, whether to learn from what we've built or try to destroy it. Holloway's offering us a chance to frame that decision to present our work in terms that make destruction harder to justify. Clara turned the question over, examining it from different sides. And if they still choose destruction, then at least the knowledge survives. Published in journals, preserved in libraries, available to anyone who comes looking. They can exile us again if they want, but they can't erase what we've proven. The decision was made in that moment, though they spent another 3 days confirming it through observation and discussion. Hannah sent word through Jonas Dr. Holloway could document their methods, could publish his findings, but the cave's exact location would remain confidential. The knowledge would be shared. The sanctuary would remain protected. Holloway spent 10 days at the cave that summer, measuring, photographing, interviewing. He was respectful of boundaries, never pushing for more information than Hannah was willing to share, never treating them as curiosities rather than colleagues. The paper he ultimately published in the Journal of Applied Agriculture was titled Geothermal Agriculture, a Case Study in Sustainable Year-Round Production. It mentioned no names, no specific location, only methods and results. But within certain circles, agricultural scientists, progressive farmers, engineers interested in unconventional solutions, the paper became a reference point. Letters arrived via Jonas from researchers asking questions about specific techniques, from farmers wanting to replicate elements of the system, from inventors proposing modifications and improvements. Hannah answered what she could, maintaining the careful balance between sharing knowledge and protecting their privacy. The correspondence created connections to a world beyond Black Ridge Hollow, a network of people who valued innovation and evidence rather than tradition and suspicion. By the autumn of 1875, the cave had evolved from a shelter into something approaching an institution. People came now with problems to solve rather than judgments to deliver. The town doctor consulted them about medicinal herbs. Ranchers asked about soil amendment. A mining engineer sought advice on managing underground water systems. Each consultation was paid fairly. Each transaction reinforced the understanding that the Thorne sisters provided value that extended beyond simple food production. Reverend Crane still preached occasionally about the spiritual dangers of relying on unnatural knowledge, but his sermons had become background noise, familiar and easily ignored. The town had made its choice not through any dramatic moment of reconciliation, but through the quiet accumulation of practical benefits. The cave fed people, the cave healed people, the cave worked. And in a world where work was the primary virtue, that was enough. The winter of 1876 came early and hard, announcing itself with a blizzard in late October that buried Black Ridge Hollow under 3 feet of snow in a single night. The storm caught the town unprepared. Harvests, only half-gathered wood piles, not yet stacked root cellars, still being filled. Within a week, the pass closed completely. Within 2 weeks, supplies began running short. The town council met in Henderson's store. 8 men gathered around a pot-bellied stove, their breath visible in the cold air despite the fire. The conversation circled the same question from different angles. How long could they last on what they had? The optimistic estimates gave them until February. The realistic ones suggested Christmas. Henderson broke the impasse with characteristic bluntness. We need to talk about the cave. Reverend Crane's voice came sharp and immediate. We will not go begging to those women. We will not validate their defiance of natural order by crawling to them in our need. Jonas Pike, invited to the meeting despite not being officially on the council, leaned forward. Natural order didn't keep anyone fed last winter. The Thorne sisters did. You want to stand on principle while children starve, that's your choice. But don't pretend it's God's will. It's just pride. The room went silent. Jonas rarely spoke at length, and when he did, people listened. His missing arm was testimony to sacrifice made in service of principles larger than himself. His opinions carried weight that Crane's increasingly hollow rhetoric could not match. Henderson seized the opening. I propose we send a delegation, not to beg, but to negotiate. Fair trade, fair terms. They have production capacity we lack. We have supplies they might need. Make it business, not charity. The vote was 6 in favor, 2 opposed. Crane and his single remaining ally, a rancher named Garrett, who believed the 1873 exile had been justified, were outvoted decisively. The council selected 3 representatives, Henderson himself, Dr. Hastings, and Jonas Pike. They would carry the town's proposal to the cave and return with whatever agreement they could negotiate. The delegation arrived on a gray afternoon pulling a sled loaded with trade goods, bolts of wool fabric, a small barrel of molasses, packets of flower seeds that Clara had once mentioned wanting, and a hand-cranked grain mill that Henderson had ordered from a catalog 2 years earlier but never sold. The offering was substantial, deliberately so. This was not a gesture. It was a statement of serious intent. Hannah met them at the cave entrance, flanked by Clara. Neither sister showed surprise at the delegation's composition or purpose. They had seen this coming, had predicted it weeks earlier when the first snows fell unusually heavy. Desperation had a rhythm predictable as seasons. Henderson did the talking, laying out the situation with straightforward honesty. The town was short on food, particularly fresh vegetables and protein. They had flour and cornmeal enough to last the winter, but monotonous diet led to illness, especially in children and elderly. They needed what the cave produced, and they were prepared to pay fair market rates plus a premium for reliability. Hannah listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing. When Henderson finished, she let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding. "You're asking us to become your primary food supplier for an entire winter. That's not a transaction. That's a commitment. We understand that. Which is why we're offering more than payment. We're offering partnership. You need things we can provide: fabric tools, access to seed catalogs, and agricultural supplies from outside the valley. We need what you produce. It's a relationship of mutual benefit." Clara spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "Last time the town decided it didn't want a relationship with us, they sent us to die in a blizzard. What happens when this winter ends and you don't need us anymore?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the delegation. Dr. Hastings shifted his weight, cleared his throat. "That was a mistake. Most of us know it was a mistake. But we can't undo it. We can only move forward from where we are." And where we are, Jonas added, his single hand resting on his knee, is a place where the town needs to accept that you're not going away. You've built something permanent here. Fighting that is pointless. Working with it makes sense. Hannah looked at Clara, the silent exchange passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. Clara's slight nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. They would accept the proposal not because they trusted the town's change of heart, but because refusing would mean storing up resentment that would eventually poison the relationship beyond repair. Better to engage on clear terms than to hold grudges that serve no practical purpose. The agreement was negotiated over 2 hours, sitting in the sisters' expanded cabin, drinking herb tea while snow fell outside the cave entrance. The town would provide raw materials and trade goods on a regular schedule. The cave would provide vegetables, herbs, eggs, and bread. All transactions would be recorded, all accounts settled monthly. The arrangement would continue as long as both parties found it beneficial, with either side free to terminate on 30 days' notice. It was a contract, formal and binding, stripped of sentiment, and based entirely on mutual self-interest, which was exactly what made it sustainable. Trust could be rebuilt gradually through reliable performance. Forced reconciliation would have collapsed under the weight of its own artificiality. The winter that followed proved the wisdom of the arrangement. The cave's production scaled up Clara, developing new growing systems that increased yield without sacrificing quality. The town's payments arrived on schedule, each delivery accompanied by detailed accounting that Henderson maintained with meticulous precision. Both parties honored their commitments because both parties benefited from continuation. But the relationship's success created its own complications. By February, people from neighboring valleys were hearing about Black Ridge Hollow's unusual food security during a harsh winter. Questions were asked, stories were told, and inevitably curiosity turned toward the source. A merchant from Silver Creek arrived in March, pulling a wagon loaded with goods, and asking to meet the women who ran the greenhouse operation he had heard about. Henderson, protective of the arrangement his town had negotiated, tried to deflect. The merchant persisted, offering premium prices for direct access to the suppliers. Hannah agreed to meet him, but only on her terms in the cave, where the evidence of what they had built would speak louder than any sales pitch. The merchant, a shrewd man named Carlson, who had made his fortune supplying mining camps, walked through the growing chambers with the calculating eye of someone assessing investment potential. This is remarkable, not just the production, but the efficiency. You're getting yields per square foot that would be impossible in conventional farming. If you could replicate this system, scale it up, you could supply the entire region. We're not interested in scaling up. Carlson stopped walking, turning to face her directly. With all due respect, Miss Thorne, you should be. What you've developed here has commercial value far beyond one small town. I could arrange financing, help you build proper facilities, connect you with markets that would pay substantially more than you're getting now. And in exchange, you'd own a percentage of our operation. You'd have say in how we run things, what we produce, who we sell to. That's how business works. Capital investment requires return and control. Hannah's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried absolute finality. We're not interested in partners who want control. This is our work. It stays our work. Carlson tried several more approaches over the next hour, adjusting his pitch, sweetening his offers, appealing to ambition and profit motive. Hannah deflected each attempt with the same essential message: the cave was not for sale, not for lease, not for partnership with anyone who wanted authority over its operations. The work would continue on the sisters' terms or not at all. After Carlson left, disappointed but not hostile, Clara raised the question that had been hovering unspoken. Are we making a mistake? He's right that we could expand, could reach more people, could make more money. Money for what? We have what we need. Expansion would mean employees, investors, people with claims on our time and decisions. It would mean losing control of the one thing we've built that's truly ours. The reasoning was sound, but it marked a choice point. The cave could remain a sustainable homestead, producing enough for their needs and the town's requirements, or it could become something larger and more complicated. They chose the former not out of fear of growth, but out of recognition that their goal had never been wealth or influence. It had been autonomy, and autonomy required clear boundaries firmly defended. Spring brought Ezra Thorne back to the cave one final time. He appeared one afternoon older and frailer than his 52 years should have made him, and stood at the entrance holding a wooden box. Hannah saw him from inside and walked out slowly, giving him time to speak first if he chose. He did not. Instead, he extended the box, his hands shaking slightly from more than just age. Inside were tools, a set of chisels their father had used for detail work, a small hand plane, a measuring square with brass fittings, tools that had belonged to William Thorne and should have passed to his daughters. I kept these after your parents died. Thought maybe I'd need them or could trade them, but they're not mine. They were never mine. Hannah accepted the box, feeling the weight of worked wood and metal, the physical legacy of a man who had understood that knowledge without tools was incomplete. Thank you. Ezra's eyes finally lifted to meet hers, and what she saw there was not the defensive hostility of their last encounter, but something closer to acceptance. You've done well here. Better than I could have. Better than anyone expected. We did what was necessary. No. He shook his head slowly. Necessary would have been surviving. You've done more than that. You've built something that matters, something that helps people. That's not necessity. That's purpose. The distinction was subtle but significant, and Hannah recognized it as the closest Ezra would come to admitting that the town had been wrong about what his nieces were capable of becoming. He could not apologize for the exile that wound was too deep, the betrayal too fundamental. But he could acknowledge that the verdict had been based on false premises, that the danger everyone had feared had been imagined, while the value had been real all along. They stood together in awkward silence for a moment, separated by history that could not be erased, but no longer actively hostile. Finally, Ezra turned to leave, then paused. Your mother would be proud. She always said you saw things other people missed. Turned out she was right. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply an old man admitting error to the young women he had wronged, offering what repair he could with the materials he had available. Hannah watched him walk away, his steps uncertain on the uneven ground, and felt something she had not expected: pity. Not for the exile he had inflicted, but for the burden he had carried since the weight of a choice that had defined him in ways he had not anticipated. Clara peered at her shoulder. "He's dying." Hannah nodded. She had seen it too. The gray pallor beneath weathered skin, the shortness of breath, the way he moved like someone whose body had begun the process of shutting down. Heart failure, probably the kind that came from years of accumulated stress and guilt. He had maybe a year, possibly less. Should we do anything? There's nothing to do. This isn't a medical problem. The truth of that assessment hung between them. Ezra's decline was not a disease that could be cured with herbs or rest. It was the physical manifestation of internal collapse, the body giving up after the spirit had already surrendered. They could offer comfort, but they could not offer healing. Some damage ran too deep. Summer brought unexpected visitors. A group of women from 3 valleys over, traveling together for safety, arrived at Black Ridge Hollow asking for directions to the cave. Henderson, now protective of the relationship the town had built with the sisters, wanted to refuse. The women insisted. They had sick children, failing gardens, husbands who dismissed their concerns. They had heard about 2 women who understood growing things, who had made barren stone produce life. They needed help, and they would not leave until they received it. Jonas guided them to the cave, trusting Hannah to decide how to respond. The women were a diverse group: a rancher's wife with calloused hands and sun-damaged skin, a merchant's daughter who had married into a farming family and discovered she hated the isolation, a widow trying to keep her late husband's homestead running against overwhelming odds. What united them was desperation and the conviction that traditional channels had failed them. Hannah listened to their problems with clinical attention, asking questions that revealed underlying causes rather than just symptoms. The rancher's wife had soil depletion from years of planting the same crops without rotation. The merchant's daughter was using irrigation techniques suited for humid climates, disastrous in Colorado's dry air. The widow's chickens were dying from a parasite that could be controlled with proper coop management. The solutions were technical, not mystical. Hannah provided detailed instructions, drew diagrams, suggested specific interventions. Clara supplemented with seeds and starter cultures, practical materials that would allow the women to implement the recommendations immediately. None of it was revolutionary. It was simply applied knowledge, the kind that accumulated from reading extensively and observing carefully. But to the women receiving the advice, it felt like revelation. They had been taught that farming was a matter of hard work and prayer, that success came from divine favor, rather than systematic understanding. The idea that soil chemistry could be measured and adjusted, that plant diseases had identifiable causes and preventable solutions, that outcomes could be improved through deliberate intervention. This was transformative. Before leaving, the rancher's wife spoke for the group. "We could pay you. Not much, but something." Hannah shook her head. "Keep your money. If the advice works, tell other women. Tell them there are answers to their problems, and the answers are knowable. Why would you care if other women know?" Because Clara responded, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "Every woman who learns to feed herself without begging is one less person who can be controlled through hunger." The statement hung in the air, its implications radiating outward. The women exchanged glances, recognition passing between them. They understood something had been offered beyond agricultural advice. They had been given permission to be competent, to trust their observations, to believe that their struggles had solvable causes rather than moral judgments attached. Word spread through networks that operated below the surface of official commerce. Women told other women who told others in turn. By autumn, the cave had become a destination for a specific kind of pilgrim, those who had problems the conventional wisdom could not solve, and enough desperation to seek unconventional answers. Hannah and Clara developed a system for handling the influx. They would see visitors one afternoon per week in groups no larger than 5. Each consultation was free, but visitors were expected to share what they learned with others who needed it. The cave was not a business, it was a node in a network, a place where information flowed rather than accumulated. The impact was gradual but measurable. Gardens improved, livestock mortality decreased. Women who had felt helpless in the face of agricultural failure discovered they could learn, could experiment, could solve problems through observation and adjustment. The transformation was practical, not ideological, but practical. Changes had political consequences. Men who had dismissed their wives' concerns about failing crops found themselves confronted with evidence of improvement. Husbands who had refused to listen to suggestions about new techniques watched yields increase when those techniques were quietly implemented. The traditional authority structure, men making decisions, women following them, began to shift not through confrontation, but through demonstrated results. Reverend Crane watched these developments with growing alarm. His sermons, already less attended than in previous years, began focusing on the dangers of women operating outside proper supervision. He preached about Eve and temptation, about the natural order of creation, about the spiritual consequences of valuing worldly knowledge over divine guidance. The congregation's response was tepid. Women who had learned to save dying gardens were not inclined to condemn the teachers who had helped them. Men who enjoyed better meals from improved harvests were not eager to return to scarcity in the name of principle. Crane's authority, already diminished, eroded further. In October of 1881, Ezra Thorne died. He went quietly in his sleep, his heart finally surrendering to the accumulated strain of years. The town buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. Reverend Crane presiding over a funeral attended by perhaps 30 people. Hannah and Clara watched from a distance, standing among the trees on the hillside, visible to anyone who looked but not participating directly. After the ceremony, as people dispersed, Jonas Pike climbed the hill to where they stood. He didn't leave you anything in a will, didn't have much to leave, but his cabin and the land it sits on revert to you as his closest kin. It's legally yours if you want it. We don't want it, Jonas nodded, having expected the answer. I'll arrange for it to be sold. Proceeds can go to the church fund or the school, wherever you think makes sense. The school. The choice was deliberate. The church represented the ideology that had condemned them. The school represented the possibility of future generations learning to think differently. Investing in education was investing in long-term change, the kind that could not be undone by a single charismatic preacher or a season of fear. Winter came again the 8th since the Exile. The cave had become an established part of the valley's infrastructure, its production integrated into the town's survival strategy. The relationship had evolved from emergency measure to standard practice, normalized through repetition and mutual benefit. But normalization brought complacency, and complacency brought danger. In January, a group of men from Silver Creek, not Carlson, who had accepted Hannah's refusal with grace, but others with less scrupulous business practices, attempted to map the cave system without permission. They wanted to understand the layout, assess the geothermal sources, determine whether similar operations could be established elsewhere. Finn spotted them first, tracking their movements through the forest with the hunter's instinct that made him so effective as an intermediary. He warned Hannah, who immediately understood the threat. Knowledge of the cave's exact configuration was strategic information. In the wrong hands, it could be used to establish competing operations, or worse, to undermine the systems that made the cave functional. Hannah confronted the surveyors directly, stepping out of the cave entrance with the Winchester rifle Jonas had given her the previous year. She did not point it at anyone. She simply held it, her hands comfortable on the weapon, her posture making clear she knew how to use it. This is private property. You're trespassing. The lead surveyor, a young man with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously opposed, tried dismissal. We're just conducting geological research. Public benefit, scientific inquiry. On land you don't own without permission for purposes that benefit you rather than the public. That's not research, that's theft. The rifle remained at her side, unthreatening but present. The other surveyors shifted nervously, suddenly aware that they were miles from town and terrain they did not know, confronting someone who had survived conditions that would have killed them. The power dynamic they had assumed educated men naturally superior to isolated women inverted sharply. The lead surveyor tried once more. There are legal ways to compel cooperation, eminent domain public interest claims. Feel free to pursue those remedies. But while you're filing paperwork in Denver, you'll leave this property immediately. And if you come back without written permission from me personally, you'll discover I take property rights very seriously. They left their surveying equipment packed hastily, their professional confidence badly shaken. Hannah watched them go, the rifle still in her hands, and understood that this was a preview of future conflicts. As the cave's value became more widely known, pressure to access or control it would increase. Protection required vigilance, clear boundaries, and the demonstrated willingness to enforce those boundaries. That night, sitting by the fire, Clara raised the question that Hannah had been avoiding. How long can we keep this up? We're two people against everyone who wants what we have. Eventually, someone with more resources and less scruples is going to succeed where those surveyors failed. So we make success more costly than it's worth. We document everything we've done and publish it. Make the knowledge public. If everyone can replicate our methods, there's no advantage to stealing our specific location. That would help others, but it also invites more people here. Hannah stared into the flames, watching patterns of combustion and heat transfer, seeing in the fire's behavior the same principles that govern the cave's geothermal system. Some things want to be contained, others want to spread. We've been trying to contain this to keep it small and controlled. Maybe that's the wrong approach. Clara understood immediately where her sister's thinking was leading. You want to teach this, not just answer questions when people come to us, but actively spread the information. If the knowledge is widely distributed, we stop being unique. We become examples rather than exceptions. Harder to target, easier to ignore. The logic was sound, but it represented a fundamental shift in their approach. For 8 years, they had maintained careful distance, engaging with the world on their terms through controlled transactions. Now they were considering active outreach, deliberately expanding their influence to paradoxically reduce their vulnerability. The decision was made over the next week through careful discussion and planning. They would compile their knowledge into a comprehensive manual, combining their father's geological research with their own agricultural innovations. The manual would be distributed freely through networks of women who had already sought their advice with explicit permission to copy and share the information. Dr. Holloway, contacted through Jonas, agreed to help with publication and distribution. His academic connections could ensure the manual reached agricultural colleges, women's organizations, and progressive farming communities across the Western territories. The knowledge would spread faster and farther than any attempt at suppression could counter. The manual took 6 months to complete. Hannah handled the technical sections: soil chemistry, geothermal systems, water management, structural engineering for cave construction. Clara contributed agricultural techniques, crop rotation schedules, seed-saving protocols, pest management, food preservation. Together, they created a document that was both theoretical and practical, explaining not just what to do, but why it worked. They titled it Principles of Sustainable Year-Round Agriculture, Cave Systems, and Geothermal Applications. The language was deliberately technical, aiming for credibility in academic circles rather than popular appeal. But they included a preface written in simpler language, addressed to women who might never attend university, but possess the intelligence and determination to implement complex systems if given clear instructions. The manual was published in the fall of 1882, 9 years after the Exile. Dr. Holloway arranged for it to be printed by a progressive publisher in Chicago, distributed through academic networks, and sold through agricultural supply catalogs. Initial circulation was modest, perhaps 300 copies in the first 6 months, but the manual had the quality of hitting existing needs that people had not quite articulated. Letters began arriving, forwarded through various intermediaries to protect the cave's exact location. A women's college in Ohio wanted permission to teach from the manual. A farming cooperative in Oregon was attempting to replicate the cave system using natural hot springs. A mining engineer in Montana had adapted the ventilation principles for improving underground working conditions. Each letter represented a small victory, a piece of knowledge escaping confinement and finding application in new contexts. The cave's innovations were being tested, refined, improved upon by people the sisters would never meet. The work had become larger than its creators, which was exactly the protection they had sought. But wider recognition brought renewed attention to Black Ridge Hollow and inevitable questions about the manual's authors. Journalists from Denver and San Francisco requested interviews. Agricultural organizations wanted the sisters to speak at conferences. Investment groups proposed franchise arrangements offering to build cave systems across the West using the Thorn method. Hannah refused every request for personal appearances or commercial partnerships. The manual contained everything she was willing to share. People could learn from it without needing access to her. The cave would remain what it had always been, a home, a laboratory, a sanctuary, not a showpiece, not a business opportunity, not a symbol to be claimed by movements or causes. The refusals frustrated some and impressed others. A newspaper editorial praised the Thorn sisters for their principled rejection of profit-seeking in favor of pure knowledge dissemination. Another condemned them for refusing to contribute their expertise to the broader economic development of the region. Both missed the point. Hannah and Clara were not making philosophical statements about capitalism or public service. They were simply defending boundaries, protecting the autonomy they had built through exile and survival. In the spring of 1883, Reverend Crane suffered a stroke. He survived but was left partially paralyzed. His speech slurred, his dominant hand useless. The congregation, already dwindled, faced a decision about his replacement. The debate revealed how thoroughly the town had changed in 10 years. The older generation wanted a traditional preacher, someone who would uphold established values and resist the disturbing changes they saw around them. The younger generation preferred someone more progressive, willing to acknowledge that the world was evolving and faith needed to evolve with it. The conflict split the church, with attendance dropping as families chose sides or simply stopped coming. Into this vacuum stepped an unexpected voice, Jonas Pike. He proposed an alternative. Instead of hiring a new preacher immediately, the church should invite guest speakers representing different perspectives. Give the congregation time to figure out what they actually needed, rather than rushing to fill the position with someone who would inevitably disappoint half the town. The proposal was accepted more from exhaustion than enthusiasm. Over the next year, Blackridge's pulpit hosted a rotating cast, a Methodist circuit rider who preached social gospel, a Catholic priest who emphasized charity work, a Quaker woman who spoke about inner light and direct revelation, even a Jewish merchant who explained his faith's perspective on community obligation. The diversity of voices normalized the idea that religious authority was not monolithic, that different approaches to spirituality could coexist without one being definitively wrong. The change was subtle but profound, eroding the foundation of certainty that had supported Crane's condemnation of the sisters years earlier. Clara attended one of these services, slipping into the back row to hear the Quaker woman speak. The sermon focused on Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, about how serving the hungry and sick was equivalent to serving God directly. The woman spoke about practical faith, about actions mattering more than beliefs, about how religious certainty often masks spiritual emptiness. After the service, several women approached Clara not to condemn, but to thank. They spoke about gardens that now thrived, children who no longer went hungry in winter, the confidence that came from understanding rather than simply hoping. Their gratitude was specific and practical, focused on measurable improvements rather than abstract salvation. Clara returned to the cave and told Hannah about the experience. They're different now. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. They see us as people who helped rather than threats to be eliminated. Time has a way of eroding certainty. People forget what they were so sure about, remember what actually worked. The observation proved prophetic as the years accumulated. The cave had become an institution older than many of the families living in Black Ridge Hollow. Children who had been born after Hannah and Clara's departure now had children of their own. The town's collective memory of why the sisters had been exiled had grown fuzzy, replaced by simple acceptance that they lived in the cave and had always lived there. Finn Whitaker, now in his 40s, had married and started a family, but still made weekly trips to the cave as much for the pleasure of the sisters' company as for trade purposes. His oldest daughter, a girl of 12 who shared her father's quiet competence, sometimes accompanied him learning the routes and protocols that would allow her to continue the connection when Finn grew too old. Jonas Pike had died in 1895, his single arm finally laying down the hammer for the last time. He had left his smithy to a young apprentice with instructions that the Thorne sisters should receive free metalwork for life. The apprentice honored the commitment, asking no questions about why such an arrangement existed. The town had stabilized into patterns that accommodated the sisters rather than excluding them. They were not invited to social gatherings, did not attend church or civic meetings, remained fundamentally separate from community life. But neither were they opposed or harassed. They existed in a space adjacent to the town, connected through commerce and consultation, but not through friendship or social obligation. It was not reconciliation. The wound of exile had never healed, had simply been covered over by time and circumstance. But it was coexistence, sustainable and even productive based on mutual recognition that some separations could not be bridged and did not need to be. In 1905, as Hannah and Clara reached their 52nd year, they began training successors. Not family, they had none but young women who sought them out, who demonstrated both aptitude and determination. These apprentices would spend months at the cave learning techniques that could not be conveyed through manuals alone, absorbing through practice and observation the accumulated wisdom of more than 3 decades. Some apprentices stayed only briefly before returning to their own communities to implement what they had learned. Others remained for years, becoming extensions of the sisters' work, carrying on experiments and expansions that Hannah and Clara no longer had the physical stamina to pursue themselves. The cave was evolving beyond its creators, preparing for the future, when those creators would no longer be present. It was becoming a legacy, a body of knowledge and practice that would outlive the people who had developed it. Dr. Holloway returned to Colorado one final time in 1907, now in his late 70s, and using a cane. He made the pilgrimage to the cave not to study, but to visit, to see in person what had become of the work he had helped document. Hannah and Clara, now 54 years old, showed him the expanded operations with quiet pride. The geothermal chambers had been optimized through 34 years of incremental improvements. The growing systems produced year-round harvests that fed the sisters, supplied the town, and generated surplus for trade. The chicken flock had expanded to 50 birds, providing eggs and meat. New chambers had been developed for specific purposes, one for mushroom cultivation, another for cheese aging, a third for storing root vegetables at precise temperatures. Holloway walked through it all with visible amazement. This is beyond what I imagined. You've created something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the country, possibly the world. A completely self-sufficient agricultural system operating in conditions that should make it impossible. We work with what we have. The cave provides the foundation. We provide the labor and observation. That's a dramatic understatement. What you've built represents decades of accumulated expertise. When I first met you, I used the word mastery. I didn't understand then how right I was. This is mastery of the highest order. Hannah exchanged a glance with Clara, a flicker of their old silent communication. When Holloway had first used that word 32 years ago, it had felt premature, possibly patronizing. Now it felt like simple description. They had indeed mastered this environment, had bent it to purposes it had never served, had proven that understanding could triumph over circumstance. Before leaving, Holloway made a request. I'm writing a book about innovation in American agriculture. I'd like to include a chapter about this place, about what you've accomplished. Not just the techniques, but the story. Two women exiled into a blizzard who survived by applying scientific principles that the people who condemned them couldn't begin to understand. Tell the story if you want, but leave our names out of it. Why you've earned recognition. Recognition changes things. Right now, we're left alone because we're useful but not famous. Fame would bring attention we don't want. Tell the story, but make us anonymous. Let the work speak for itself. Holloway agreed, though clearly disappointed. His book, published 2 years later, included the chapter exactly as promised. The cave was described in detail, the methods explained thoroughly, but the sisters appeared only as two highly skilled agriculturalists whose names were withheld at their request. The chapter became one of the book's most cited sections, referenced in agricultural journals and college courses, but it added no new attention to the cave because readers had no way to find it. The strategy of controlled visibility had succeeded. The work was known. The workers remained obscure. Knowledge spread while privacy persisted. By 1930, Hannah and Clara were 77 years old. Their bodies had been worn down by decades of physical labor in challenging conditions, but their minds remained sharp, their hands still capable of delicate work. They moved more slowly now, relied more heavily on the younger women who managed the day-to-day operations, but they still consulted on difficult problems, still refined techniques, still observed and documented. They had lived in the cave for 57 years, longer than many marriages, longer than most careers. The stone had become as familiar as their own bodies, its rhythms and moods as readable as human expressions. They knew which passages would flood in spring, which chambers would warm in winter, which cracks in the ceiling needed monitoring for potential collapse. The knowledge was intuitive, now accumulated beyond the point where it could be fully articulated. This was the expertise that could not be written in manuals or taught in courses. It could only be acquired through decades of patient attention, through the slow accretion of understanding that came from living inside a system rather than studying it from outside. In the winter of 1934, the 61st winter since their exile, Hannah and Clara made final preparations. They were not dying, not yet, but they were old enough to recognize that time was finite and arrangements needed to be made. They compiled their records, organized their documentation, ensured that the systems they had built would continue functioning after they were gone. The cave had 3 capable managers, now women in their 30s and 40s, who had trained for years and understood the work thoroughly. The agricultural production would continue. The knowledge would be preserved. The legacy would persist. On a February afternoon, with snow falling softly through the fissure in the ceiling, Hannah and Clara sat together in 2 wooden chairs they had built decades earlier. They had positioned the chairs on the small porch outside their cabin, facing toward the cave entrance, toward the light that filtered down from the world above. They sat in comfortable silence, wrapped in a single wool blanket that Clara had woven years ago from fleece traded from the town. The blanket was worn thin, in places patched and repatched, but it was warm and familiar and exactly what they needed. Neither spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. They had spent 61 years finishing each other's thoughts, anticipating each other's needs, moving through the world as a single consciousness distributed across 2 bodies. Words had always been inadequate to the reality of what they shared. The snow continued falling, melting before it reached them, turning to mist in the warm air rising from the geothermal chambers below. The cave breathed around them, patient and eternal, the stone doing what stone did, enduring, sheltering, providing foundation for the fragile human lives that briefly occupied its spaces. They looked peaceful, not happy exactly. Happiness had never been their goal, but satisfied. They had been given an impossible situation and had transformed it into possibility. They had been condemned to death and had chosen life. They had been told they had no place in the world and had carved out a place the world could not take from them. The town buried them in the small cemetery outside Black Ridge Hollow, in graves positioned to overlook the valley they had fed for 6 decades. The funeral was attended by more than 200 people, representatives from communities across 3 territories, women who had learned from their manual men who had benefited from their innovations, Children who had grown up knowing that somewhere in the mountains, two women had proven that knowledge and determination could overcome any exile. The headstone was simple limestone, quarried from the cave itself. It bore no scripture, no poetry, no elaborate epitaph, just one sentence carved deep enough to last centuries. They fed the people. Finn's granddaughter, standing at the grave with her own daughter, read the words aloud. The child, too young to understand their weight, asked a question adults had learned not to voice. Were they happy? The granddaughter considered the question carefully before answering. I don't think they cared about happy. I think they cared about useful, about building something that worked, about being left alone to do their work without someone else deciding they weren't allowed to. The child processed this, then asked another question. Did the town ever say sorry? The granddaughter looked across the cemetery at the assembled crowd, at the evidence of lives touched and changed. Some things don't get apologized for. They just get moved past. The best you can hope for is that people learn and then do better next time. Whether Blackridge Hollow had learned remained an open question. But the cave continued its work, managed now by the next generation, producing food and knowledge in equal measure, proving year after year that what had once been called impossible was merely difficult, and difficulty was just another problem waiting to be solved through observation, patience, and the stubborn refusal to accept exile as ending.